The Strait of Hormuz, as we've been talking about, a major shipping route. Now, the White House says the strait is now open, but Iran is restricting the passage of oil tankers.
There is a plan on paper that could end the most dangerous choke point in the global energy system. A plan that, if executed, would mean that the closure of the Strait of Hormuz, the closure that is right now sending oil prices past $119 a barrel, stranding hundreds of tankers, and threatening to push the global economy into recession, would never again have the power to hold the world hostage. The plan involves digging pipelines, building ports, relocating infrastructure, and engineering solutions across some of the most hostile terrain on Earth. It would cost, depending on which estimate you believe, somewhere between $200 and $500 billion. It would take, if built at the absolute fastest pace ever achieved for the comparable infrastructure, a minimum of 10 to 15 years. More likely, 20 to 25. And every engineer who has seriously studied it agrees. It can be done. It has just never been worth doing until now. This is the Geo Network. And today, we are going to do something that almost no analyst has done properly. We are going to go through every bypass option for the Strait of Hormuz, explain exactly what each one would require to build and operate, why none of them have been built at sufficient scale, and what it would actually take to build a world where 20% of the global oil supply is not controlled by a 21-mile gap of contested water. Let's start with what we already have. Because there are existing bypasses, they are just nowhere near large enough. The most important existing bypass is Saudi Arabia's East-West pipeline, also known as the Petroline. This pipeline runs from the eastern province oil fields near Abqaiq and Ras Tanura, crossing the entire Arabian Peninsula to the port of Yanbu on the Red Sea coast. It was built specifically for the scenario we are now living through, a disruption to Strait of Hormuz transit. At full capacity, it can move approximately 5 million barrels of oil per day. The Strait of Hormuz in normal times carries 20 million barrels per day. The Petroline handles 25% of that capacity. It is currently running near its maximum, and it is not easily expandable, at least not quickly. Pipeline infrastructure at this scale requires years of engineering, procurement, and construction, even when political will and funding are aligned. The UAE's ADNOC pipeline to Fujairah port on the Gulf of Oman adds approximately 1.5 million barrels per day of bypass capacity. Combined with the Petroline, that is 6.5 million barrels per day of existing bypass, roughly 32% of normal Hormuz throughput, leaving nearly 14 million barrels per day with no alternative route. Now let's look at what would need to be built to close that gap completely. Option 1. Expand existing pipelines. The Petroline could theoretically be expanded. Saudi Arabia's pipeline network engineers have studied this repeatedly. The constraints are not primarily financial. Saudi Aramco has the capital. The constraints are physical. The pipeline route crosses 1,200 kilometers of Arabian desert. Expanding capacity means adding parallel pipeline runs, upgrading pumping stations, building additional export terminals at Yanbu, and developing the deep-water berths capable of handling VLCC supertankers on the Red Sea coast. The engineering challenge of each of these components is manageable. The timeline for doing all of them simultaneously is not less than 6 to 8 years under optimal conditions. Cost estimate for full Petroline expansion to 12 million barrels per day, approximately $30 to $50 billion. Option 2. New Omani export infrastructure. Oman is positioned in a uniquely important geographic location. It sits along the Gulf of Oman, on the other side of the Hormuz choke point, and shares a land border with the UAE and Saudi Arabia. A pipeline from Saudi Arabia's eastern oil fields or from Iraq's Basra fields running south through the empty quarter desert to an Omani port on the Arabian Sea would bypass the strait entirely and reach open ocean without passing through any contested waterway. This option has been studied extensively. The challenges are immense. The empty quarter, the Rub al Khali, is the largest continuous sand desert on Earth, covering approximately 650,000 square kilometers. Building a major oil pipeline through it is not impossible. Pipelines cross the Sahara, the Arctic tundra, and the Alaskan wilderness. But the logistics of construction, maintenance, and security in the empty quarter represent a level of operational challenge that pushes timelines and costs substantially higher than comparable projects in more accessible terrain. An Oman pipeline from Saudi fields, built to carry 5 million barrels per day, would cost an estimated $15 to $25 billion and require 7 to 10 years of construction under favorable conditions. Option 3. The Iraq-Turkey Northern Route expansion. Iraq currently exports a modest amount of oil through a pipeline running north to the Turkish port of Ceyhan on the Mediterranean, bypassing the Gulf entirely. This pipeline has historically moved around 500,000 barrels per day, well below its technical capacity of approximately 1.6 million barrels per day. The difference between actual and potential throughput is primarily political. Conflicts between Iraq's federal government and the Kurdistan regional government over oil revenues have repeatedly disrupted operations. If the political conflicts were resolved and the pipeline expanded to its full capacity and additional parallel lines added, the Iraq-Turkey route could potentially carry 3 to 4 million barrels per day. This would represent a meaningful addition to bypass capacity, but it comes with political dependencies on Turkish cooperation and on stability in a pipeline corridor that crosses some of the most turbulent territory in the Middle East. Option 4. The Pakistan route. Pakistan's Gwadar port, developed with Chinese investment as part of the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, sits on the Arabian Sea, outside the Gulf entirely. A pipeline running from Iranian or Gulf fields through Pakistan to Gwadar would theoretically provide another bypass route. This option faces the most complex combination of geopolitical, security, and engineering obstacles of any scenario discussed here. Iran-Pakistan relations are fraught. The route crosses Balochistan, a province with an active insurgency. Chinese involvement adds another dimension of geopolitical complexity. This option is the least likely to be developed as part of a Western-led bypass strategy. Option 5. LNG, the hardest bypass problem of all. Everything discussed so far addresses the oil bypass challenge. LNG is an entirely different and more difficult problem. Qatar's Ras Laffan facility, which supplied 20% of the world's LNG before Iranian missile strikes damaged it in March 2026, is located on the Gulf Coast. Its LNG exports must transit the Strait of Hormuz because there is no pipeline alternative for liquefied natural gas out of the Gulf region. Building an LNG bypass would require either a dedicated pipeline carrying natural gas across the Arabian Peninsula to the Red Sea or Arabian Sea coast, and then a new LNG liquefaction facility at the end of that pipeline, or a fundamental restructuring of where LNG production infrastructure is located. Neither option is a near-term solution. A new LNG mega facility comparable to Ras Laffan costs tens of billions of dollars and takes 10 to 15 years to design, permit, and build even in optimal conditions. The damage to Ras Laffan represents a structural supply disruption that cannot be bypassed. It can only be repaired, and that repair will take 3 to 5 years, constrained by the global supply chain for the turbines and heat exchangers required. So what is the total cost of genuine Hormuz independence? Let's try to put a number on the full program. Full Petroline expansion, $30 to $50 billion. New Oman pipeline route, $15 to $25 billion. Iraq-Turkey route expansion, $5 to $10 billion. New port infrastructure at Yanbu, Fujairah, and Gwadar, $10 to $20 billion. LNG pipeline and new liquefaction facility, $60 to $100 billion. Security, monitoring, and maintenance infrastructure over 20 years, $20 to $40 billion. Total, approximately $140 to $245 billion. Call it $200 billion as a central estimate, with realistic ranges from $150 to $300 billion, depending on scope, cost overruns, which in mega project history are virtually guaranteed, and the specific route choices made. $200 to $300 billion sounds enormous. And it is. But let's put it in context. The current Hormuz crisis has pushed oil prices from $70 to $119 a barrel, an increase of approximately $49 per barrel. The world consumes approximately 100 million barrels of oil per day. Every day of crisis at current prices costs the global economy roughly $4.9 billion in excess energy costs compared to pre-crisis prices. The crisis has been running for approximately 35 days as of this recording. At that rate, the excess cost already embedded in the global economy approaches $170 billion, already approaching the lower end of the bypass construction estimate. If this crisis runs for 6 months, which the LNG repair timeline alone suggests is possible, the excess energy cost to the global economy will exceed $900 billion. More than 3 times the cost of building a complete Hormuz bypass infrastructure. The world has spent, and will spend, far more being held hostage to this choke point than it would cost to end that hostage situation permanently. And yet the bypass infrastructure has never been built at the necessary scale. Why not? The answer reveals something important about how energy infrastructure decisions are actually made. Building bypass capacity at this scale requires cooperation between multiple sovereign states: Saudi Arabia, UAE, Oman, Iraq, Turkey, Pakistan, each with its own political interests, revenue concerns, and strategic calculations. It requires the agreement of energy companies, Saudi Aramco, Qatar Energy, ADNOC, that have existing infrastructure investments optimized for current routes. It requires the political willingness of consuming nations, Europe, Asia, the United States, to fund infrastructure that benefits a global commons, but from which they cannot directly capture all their turns. In normal condi, the cost-benefit calculation never quite tips in favor of the investment. The Strait of Hormuz has been closed before, partially, temporarily, and each time, markets adjusted and the crisis passed before the political will to build permanent alternatives coalesced. This time may be different. The scale of the current disruption, 95% traffic reduction through the strait, partial destruction of the world's largest LNG facility, oil prices at their highest levels in years, global inflation accelerating, is large enough and sustained enough that the political conversations about bypass infrastructure are happening at a level of seriousness they have not reached before. Saudi Arabia's East-West pipeline, which has been running near capacity, is already under discussion for urgent expansion. The UAE has announced plans to accelerate Fujairah port development. American policymakers are discussing whether the Defense Finance Corporation could backstop insurance for alternative routing arrangements. G7 leaders issued a statement in late March 2026 acknowledging the need for energy infrastructure resilience. None of this is a bypass plan. It is the beginning of a conversation that, if the current crisis persists long enough, might become one. The question for the global economy, for energy security planners, and for the countries that depend on Gulf energy is stark. How many times does the world need to be held hostage to 21 miles of contested water before it decides the insurance premium for an alternative is worth paying? The engineering is solvable. The timeline is known. The cost is calculable. The only missing ingredient has been the political will that comes from sustained, unacceptable pain. That pain is here now. Whether it lasts long enough to translate into infrastructure that prevents the next crisis, that is the question that will define energy security for the next half-century. Drop your country in the comments. Are you watching from a country that depends on Gulf energy? And in our next video, we are going to look at what the world's energy map looks like if the strait never fully reopens, and which countries survive it and which don't. This is Terra Break Explains.